welcome to everybody for our World of Whiskey tasting this evening. Super excited to get into it as per usual. Just before we introduce our two guests, I thought we'll introduce the UC United Cellars team first. Jane, I don't know if you can just launch the slides for me, please.
Yeah, sure. 1 moment.
So firstly, we've got he's our whiskey and spirits expert here at United Cellars, Luke Collins. Luke previously ran a whiskey, spirits and cocktails business in Shanghai before coming to Australia to work with United. And he's told me his Desert Island whiskey is a Lagavulin 60-year-old paired with beef Wellington and Carlos Santana Supernatural on the soundtrack, which I rate, Luke. I think that's a great combination.
It's got to be, right? It's got to be. You can't be getting bored on a desert island.
So welcome, Luke. Of course, we've got Jane, our head of events. Welcome, Jane.
Hi, guys. Thanks for joining.
And myself, one of the senior brokers here. Now, our guest this evening is Geraint or G. David. He's the National Training Manager for Southtrade, one of Australia's premium spirits distributors. G's got over 20 years worth of experience in the industry. Same question I asked to G with regards to the Desert Island whiskey. He said it was a Sazerac 18-year-old, which he calls the Kentucky Champagne, which is, I think, a nice one to describe it as. And I asked if you could symbolize whiskey in a word, what would it be? And he said history, which is an interesting one and certainly something I think we'll get into this evening. Now, G has actually kindly brought a second guest this evening, which is Andy Milne, who is Southtrade's whiskey expert. So I didn't ask you that question, Andy, which I apologize for. I don't know if you've got an answer off the cuff, but welcome to both of you, I should say, as well.
Yeah, I was funnily enough just asked that question about 20 minutes ago by one of our staff, saying what's your favorite whiskey that you've ever had, and it's an odd one, but it's a 5-year-old 1960s Clynelish by Gordon MacPhail for Sistanti. It's an Italian distributor, and it just blew my mind as to what 5-year-old whiskey can be that intense and rich and full. And it was a third fill cask as well, so it was pale as anything. But it was probably one of the most amazing whiskies I've ever had. And what defines whiskey to me is conversation and friendship. I think it's friends I've made across the world, 100% been formed through whiskey.
Excellent. Oh, fantastic. So just before we get into the tasting, there's a couple of bits of admin I should mention. Now, if you've come to our wine tastings, you'd be familiar with the Wheel of Wine. So it's basically your chance to get a $50 credit for your next order at United Cellars. Jane, if you could just move us on one there so I can show the slide. So between each bracket, well, in this case, whiskey, we'll be doing a short quiz question. Just text your name, your email, and your number to the number on the screen there with your answer. We'll enter you into the Wheel of Wine. One correct answer gets you 3 entries. An incorrect answer gets you 1. So it's all to play for. And obviously, being a slightly more intimate tasting than usual, you've got more chance to win. So good luck with that. Just moving forward, as I mentioned, we're a smaller tasting this evening, and we've got some great presenters and a great knowledge base here. So we want it to be as interactive as possible. Comments, questions, tasting notes are more than welcome. A few weeks ago, we had a chap who described his Sancerre to well, he likened it to a caress of a woman's thigh. So you can be as abstract or esoteric as you like with them. It's all welcome here. So yeah, please do that. You can either use the chat box or just feel free to unmute and get that question or comment in. But anyway, we're going to launch into whiskey number 1, which is the Sazerac. So I'm going to hand over to G to take us to New Orleans. So welcome, G.
Thank you, Luke. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I have a lot of trouble actually just stopping talking, so it's going to be quite difficult for me to monitor this sort of timeline and whatever. So you'll just have to kind of bleep or let me know when I'm overrunning. But there's something really close to my heart. The whiskies that come out of the Buffalo Trace distillery. I some 20 years plus ago was a bartender in London, and when the product launched in London in the year 2000, it was just into the year 2000, 1999 in the US. It came about with this beautiful kind of freshness of a spirit in the bourbon category, because it had sort of got a little bit stale at the time. And so when Buffalo Trace hit the shelves, or in my instance, in the speed rails of cocktail bars, that it was like an overnight success. And a lot of bartenders, it was sort of like a go-to, you know, it was always almost attached to one of your arms, you know, when you're in a shift. So it was a perfect start for me to be introduced to that distillery. But having had some years previous in sort of training and education, I knew about the history of the whiskies there, which is an enormous story. But for this evening, we're talking about their straight rye. And if we break that down just a little bit, we at the distillery, we make 4 recipes. We call them mash bills. We make 2 rye mashed bourbons, a wheated bourbon, and then a straight rye. Okay, so the bourbons, of course, have to be a minimum of 51% corn in their mash bill, whereas the rye, we flip those grains and we have rye as our dominant grain. So this delivers a lot more spice and a lot more of those dry fruit characteristics. But with the product itself, it's just one of those incredible stories that date back to the sort of mid 1800s, where at the time cocktails were being made, lots of weird and wonderful products were being created in New Orleans, and 2 gentlemen were just sort of thrown together in the whirlwind of cocktail culture at the time, and a cocktail was made called the Sazerac. Now, I don't know whether you know the history, of course, with the wine itself, but it was actually a brandy. Originally, the name Sazerac was a brandy house, and that was what the contents of the cocktail included. But because of the phylloxera plague at the time, around about 1860s, you know, as you know, destroying almost up to 9/10 of France's vineyards. No more wine, no more brandy, no more cognac. The product dried up, the availability. And so what we had then was the use of the next best thing. And the bartender at the time put his hand on a local rye whiskey and started making the drink. So we have a Sazerac cocktail from the 1850s, which is a beautiful story. The actual site of the Sazerac house today is actually the same site of that coffee house back in the 1850s. So it's a real lovely kind of, full circle story. But if you haven't already, I'd love for you to pick up your glass and have a little nose and get used to those wonderful aromas, the elements of that spice and dry fruit, maybe even some cocoa and chocolate there as well.
Yeah,
picking up.
It's something Luke and I were talking about a minute ago as well, and it's definitely, you get a hit of vanilla, of course. But for me, one of the biggest things about the Sazerac is that you just get this huge hit of orange coming through on the nose. Yep. And yep. It's really, really intense as well. And I was saying as well, it's been a little while since I last had Sazerac, and I kind of forgot how strong that really was on the nose. It's really prominent. It's amazing. It's a nice little memory to go back to.
Yeah, absolutely. And the intensity of it, I think, is right up there in that beautiful aroma. But then it shows a lot of subtlety, I think, in the palate, just because of that wonderful aging. Of course, we still use brand new charred oak barrels for our rye whiskey. And so, 6 years of aging with a rye there's a lot going on, especially in the temperatures of Kentucky. And, you've got that spirit going in and out of the wood continuously through that period, which just creates this beautiful sort of natural sweetness from, of course, the corn involved with the rye, but just that wonderful balance, I think, of flavors. This one thing that stands out for me is how balanced the whiskey is.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's interesting for me. One point I'm really curious about as well, G, is I love Sazerac. You mentioned the cocktail in as part of the history, right, of
Yeah.
Sazerac. And for me, that cocktail is all about balance of really powerful, intense flavors. I'm
Yeah.
curious though, because Sazerac is behind the bitters, right? The Peychaud bitters.
Yes, that's right.
Is that still to this day made in at the same location?
Yeah, so in our renovated, rejuvenated, if you like, restyled coffee house, that's where we make our bitters right there. So the old story from the 1850, actually the bartender's name was Thomas Handy. And that's in homage to him, we create a whiskey once a year in our antique collection called the Thomas H. Handy, which is a rye whiskey. Beautiful, another sort of, barrel strength, is cask strength whiskey, but still only just over that 6 years of age. But because him and his colleague or partner at the time, Antoine Peychaud, created this drink, the Peychaud bitters was really the key element in the flavor profile. And of course, it's New Orleans, so they loosed it with a bit of absinthe or a local pastis, anise flavored alcohol. And of course, you talk about balance. I think that if anything's like a classic cocktail, you always talk about balance. There's nothing that stands out in a way of a leading flavor profile. So in complete, awe of being able to make a drink like that back in the 1850s, we're still enjoying them today, thankfully. And of course, being a registered company back in the 1850s, Sazerac is just still very much a family-owned company. We were actually bought by the Sazerac company a few years back now at South Trade, which puts us in a great position to get our hands on some of the most amazing whiskey in the world. So happy days for the bourbon and rye fans.
I'm told that 18-year-old is a pretty hard one to get your hands on. Any of that kicking around Australia, G?
Well, I'll bring Andy in here as well, because we unfortunately had a drop this year in our allocation. So because they only picked a very small amount of barrels this year, it's only a once a year pick. And, the evaporation loss over the 18 years of aging this year, actually, it was collectively 76%. So, when you fill a barrel of 200 liters and you lose 76% of it, there's not a lot to go around afterwards. So it's a strange one. Yeah.
I can definitely confirm that 17, 18 years ago, we were not best at forecasting. I think the level that we thought that it would be today is definitely not what it is. And so you lose all that liquid over the years, but also just a plan. And I said the CEO, I remember the first time he presented to us, he said he did a 25-year plan for the business, and within 5 years we hit the volume that he thought was going to happen in 25 years. So we're playing a game of chasing our tail, and unfortunately, when it comes to old liquids such as Saz 18 and Eagle Rare 17 and the rest of that antique collection, it's a game of cat and mouse, and unfortunately we're many steps behind where we should be. And so each year it's not a case of you sell more Buffalo Trace and you do better as a business, you get more allocation each year. It's purely a case of we've got this much this year. This is what we put away, and the more we get hotter years in America, then the more evaporates and the more we lose.
Yep.
So it's a double-edged sword and it's a challenge, but we just keep on, and what we can offer and what we can get to the Australian people, we do.
Excellent. Now, I'm keen to open up the floor a little bit, and Murray, you left a great comment a second ago. You're obviously drinking it with ice. What are your thoughts on this one? I saw you sipping a few there. What are your tasting notes?
Yeah, well, I've done gin tasting, and what we did was we tasted the gin straight, and then you try it with a bit of ice, and then you try it with a botanical. So I thought I'd do the same here, but without the botanical. It doesn't need that, but I actually quite like it straight. I think the ice kind of Well, as my daddy would say, it dilutes it.
And Murray, if I can jump in there, I see that you've got a nice big block of ice there. So
That's it.
you're obviously a serious drinker with the ice. So this is one thing, it's quite funny you should hold your glass up like that, because I always talk about Sazerac rye being my Kentucky Chardonnay. So the Saz 18 is my Kentucky Champagne, and this is my Chardonnay. But I usually have a big Chardonnay bowl glass and put one of those big blocks of ice in there, and then guzzle like about half a bottle of Sazerac over the top of that. But it's interesting because that block of ice will, of course, chill, but very slowly dilute. And the flavor profile just tells us a different story for me then as it does that. So nice to see you trying that.
Yes, it's the big ice blocks are really good. Like you say, they dissolve slowly, so you're not drinking a diluted drink in 5 minutes. It'll take half an hour. You'll actually find you actually finished your drink long before then, and on to the next one. And your ice block is still there. You don't need to get up and refill.
Yeah. That's smart.
And
That's efficient.
By the way, these ice blocks they come out of it's a 6 ice block silicone square container at $1.50 at Kmart.
Oh, fantastic!
They're
There
great.
we go.
What a good find.
I used to buy them from a fancy cocktail shop in London, and I said to a friend of mine over here, it's just like, oh, I'm on a breaking. I was just like, where do I get them? And he said exactly the same thing. He said, go to Kmart and get the Kmart ones. He said, they're just as good and last just as long.
Exactly.
Fantastic. I'm keen to ask, well, G and Luke, in what kind of context do you see this whiskey in terms of as a consumer? It really working? Is it a more kind of cocktail, as we've kind of alluded to its history, a cocktail oriented drop, or is it something that, say, a Scotch drinker would enjoy as something a little bit different? Where would you kind of place this in the kind of spectrum of whiskey?
Do you want to go, Luke, or do you want?
Yeah, sure. For me, with Sazerac, it's the thing is, I am really, really, really focused on Sazerac the cocktail. Anyway, it's kind of one of my go-to drinks. So for me, it'll always push me towards that, leaning into mixing with it. But that said, in terms of having a rye just to sip on, and even with a glass with a block of ice, it's incredible. One of the things that always strikes me as a bit odd is when people look at adding ice to a whiskey as a bad thing to do. I mean, at the end of the day, sometimes you want a nice big leather armchair in the evening where it's cold out and you want a nice neat whiskey or something like that. But other times, especially here in Australia, I mean, a block of ice is going to be brilliant, and I think Sazerac is almost perfectly suited to that. I mean, we were talking a minute ago, the fact that it's really, really intense and it's got a good level of length to the finish as well, so it's not just disappearing. It means it can actually stand up against the cold and that dilution. It can really stand up to that, so it's pretty good. It's a good all-rounder for me.
Yeah, if I can just add that as well. I mean, we've got a slide up there that suggests that the rye whiskey itself was kind of out of production for almost or over 115 years, which was definitely the case at the distillery because of the way that rye reacts in your sort of everyday production. But rye as a style of whiskey was very much out of vogue and almost forgotten about. We were still making small quantities, aging them for a lot longer. But again, going back to that launch of Buffalo Trace, the renaming of the distillery in 1999, this was when cocktail culture was changing. This is when we started drinking more, spirit-forward cocktails, and definitely between, the London and New York kind of epicenters of cocktail culture. That's what was driving that. And Buffalo Trace recognized that. But of course, you make the spirit again in its quantity, but you have to lie it down for 6 years before you can put it in a bottle. So 2005, when it launched, I mean, Andy just alluded to the fact that we have these issues every year. Sazerac Rye has literally been keeping up with, demand, or trying to keep up the demand. We generally used to run out pretty much every year, to the disappointment of many bartenders around the country. But you know, the good thing is that we've kind of caught up with that, and essentially here in Australia, we're off our allocation there now. We can, you know, go out and sell more of it, and it's just such a beautiful representation of that style of whiskey that I think can be used as a straight up as a cocktail, or even a mixed drink as well. You know, with your favorite sort of soda or fruit cocktail. You know, it's got that lovely spice fruitiness to it.
Murray's just said after 116 years, I believe the original guy may well have retired. So yeah, fair point.
Yeah, well, you know, you got to hand the baton on at some stage. Right?
He's doing well if he's still going, but yeah, fair enough.
Either that or he's very well preserved.
Well, he drinks Sazerac right. What are you gonna do?
That's my
stuff.
excuse anyway for drinking.
Yeah.
Excellent stuff. So I think that's a good place to move on to quiz question number 1. So grab your phone and get a text in for your chance to get that $50 credit. So the question is, the town of Lynchburg, Tennessee, is a dry county is home to which famous distillery? Jim Beam, Jack Daniel, or Canadian Club? So just remember 1, 2, or 3, the number rather than the actual answer, to the text number on the screen there with your name, email, and the answer. And we'll get that drawn at the end of the evening. G, was just whilst everyone's getting their text in, was there anything else that you wanted to kind of touch upon with Sazerac?
No, I think we'll leave it at that. I'm you know, obviously open to any questions, and even if it's after the session, if anybody wants to reach me through you guys, and quite happy to answer any questions. But look, for me, it's just remembering that really is the sort of quintessential style of straight rye whiskey. 6 years in a barrel, beautiful complexity and really depth of flavor, and just so easy to drink. I mean, I think that you can tell that only got opened about half an hour ago. So don't tell anyone. But thanks, guys. I appreciate your time.
Perfect. Thank you.
No problem at all. No, very, very interesting. So well done to everybody who texted in with the answer number 2. It was, of course, Jack Daniels. So 3 points to you if you got that one correct. If you didn't, you still get 1 point. So, you know, good chance for you to still win at the end of the night. So we're now going to move on to whiskey number 2, which is, of course, the Rampur. And I'm going to hand over, I believe, to both, to Andy, but then also G as well. So take it away.
Thanks. So Rampur. We'll do a lot of history first, and then I'll actually talk about whiskey, because I think it's kind of pretty important in the context of world whiskey. You know, you look at the amount of years and the sort of amount of decades and centuries that we've been making whiskey. It goes a long way back in Scotland, you know, to sort of before records began. Sort of 1400s is kind of where we're thinking really, you know, where whiskey began in Scotland. Ireland, very similar timelines. The US, you know, a little bit later, but similar. You know, we're talking centuries of whiskey making, and we forget that the rest of the world is making spirits and making liquid that's been distilled. And historically, you know, the first spirit ever produced was believed to be in China, or certainly in Asia, and it was, you know, through alembic distillation, and it was used as medicinal purposes, effectively. And you kind of break it all back and move it around, and it started as medicine, and then the Brits got involved, and they were colonizing most of the world at the time, and, you know, not the best story, but they were going around from place to place and starting out their colonization, and in that they brought with them distillation, and they, you know, across different places, they realized that while the Chinese were looking at this and going, this is great medicine, the Brits were going, this is really good grog, and, you know, we're pretty happy when we have lots of this as we go around the world. So we kind of took distillation across the world as a way of creating something for us, effectively, and it was always, you know, the Brits creating something for the Brits. And so, you know, we turned up in in the Caribbean, and we decided to make rum because that's what was available. One of the first fleet that landed in Australia, one of the first things that landed here was a still. And straight away we moved that to the closest sugar plantation and started making rum in Australia for that exact reason. It's like wherever we go, we make grog. And India is no different. But India was slightly unusual in the sense that there's less legislation over the years and less rules. And so in Scotland, it's very defined and very strict. You want to make single malt whiskey, you have to make it with 100% malted barley. It has to come from one distillery. It has to be 40% ABV. If you want to make bourbon, you have to be in America. You don't have to be in Tennessee, but you have to be in America, and you have to be making it with 51% corn. And you have to make it 40% ABV, slightly different in Australia, but there's these strict rules. Go to India, it's a little less strict. And it's very similar in the sense to a lot of the New World countries, such as Japan, Thailand. They're all, and Australia, we're all learning as we go and changing and developing. And so we've not really quite found the strict legislation and the rules. So the majority of whiskey consumed in India is what we would call rum, but they call whiskey. And they refer to it as whiskey, and it's made in a style that tastes like whiskey, but it's actually a molasses-based rather than a barley-based, which is how we produce most whiskey, or certainly single malt whiskey. One of our other distilleries that we work with, called Paul John, they actually make a brand called Officer's Choice, and Officer's Choice makes something like 36 million 9-litre cases per annum, and that's just consumed in India. This isn't consumed anywhere else in the world. This is just in India. 36 million 9-litre cases. They're the biggest whiskey brand in Australia, and bizarrely, 80% of that is Tetra Pak as well. So, like a little milk carton, you'd get a little 200 ml carton of whiskey and as your little sipper for the way home, or sort of pop that on your toast. It's probably good on cereal, I reckon. But it's a very different idea of consumption and drinking in India, and the sort of the common theme for drinking is not about, in Australia we drink long and heavy into the night, and we go at it and give it a red hot go, but we do it for several hours in many bars. In India, the culture is more a case of you go quick, but you go short. And so you go into a bar for an hour after work, you may go through half a bottle of whiskey, but you go in that moment and go quick, and then you go home. And that's sort of the consumption trend. And so the whole process is very much about cheap liquid, quick liquid, go. And the idea of single malt never really came across many of these producers. And Radico, who make Rampur, they've been going since the 1930s, 1940s. And well, no, it's on my screen. It's 1943. I like those prompts. It's only been about 25 years that we've been making single malt whiskey, and the biggest reason for that is because they were thinking about their own home market, and domestically, no one really cared about single malt whiskey. It was a sort of a byproduct, sort of a secondary thought. And a few brands had tried and given it a go and failed locally. And it wasn't until they realized that actually their export should be single malt, and domestically it's what's called whiskey, but it's not whiskey. And so after this long process, we eventually hit this point. It's like, actually, yeah, that's the way we're going to do it. And I think in 2004, the first Indian whiskey was released by Amrut. And bear in mind, there's only 4 distilleries exporting whiskey in India. So it's a huge country. It's, I think, 1.3, 1.4 billion population, massive landmass. But there's only 4 distilleries that are exporting because their market domestically is huge. And so why bother? It's the same with American wine. The best American wine stays in America because they've got enough people there to consume it and drink it that, the best stuff doesn't make it outside of their own country. So it took a long time for India to go, well, this is a new expansion. And it's really only relatively recently that they've nailed it and they've started getting it right. And so what we do see externally in other countries is proper single malt whiskey. There's no molasses in these. It's 100% single malt. It's 100% malted barley, all made from one distillery, and proper whiskey as you would expect from any distillery in Scotland and Ireland and so forth. They are a little bit unique. So Rampur itself is in the northeast of India. So a place called Uttar Pradesh. The town is called Rampur. The region is Uttar Pradesh. And location-wise, we're about, on a distance, but we're pretty close to the Nepalese border on the east coast. And it's this amazing place. And India as a country makes amazing whiskies. But we kind of forget that because we're always sitting there and go, well, Scotland's been making whiskey for years. They're the best. They must be really good at this. And America's been making whiskey for years, so they must be the obvious choice. And it's, you know, it's looking at a menu and going, I know this, I know this, I know this. And you kind of, you pick out 2 or 3 things that you know as fact. It's like, well, Scotland make good whiskey, Ireland make good whiskey, America makes good whiskey. I'll probably pick that before I pick the Indian whiskey because I've never heard of that. And who knew that India even made whiskey? So it's the biggest challenge that India and Thailand and, you know, Japan less so. They've got some pretty good PR out of it for the last few years, so they're doing okay. But it is a huge ongoing challenge for the 4 Indian producers. It's actually how do we build this and how do we grow this?
Just a question on that, Andy. So do you think it's sort of a bit of a, I guess, marketing and maybe a few awards around them, plus a bit more marketing will sort of start to bring them into leagues with like where Japan is at the moment?
Yeah, Japan got there, and I worked for a retailer in the UK years ago, and we were giving away minis of Yamazaki 12-year-old with every purchase of whiskey over £50 to get people to like Japanese whiskey and to get people to understand what was happening. And all of a sudden they win world's best whiskey. I think it was Jim Murray was the first one that sort of kicked them off, and then there was a slew of awards thereafter. But it's, we can invest in PR ourselves, but it's unless there's that story that is something like Jim Murray's Whiskey Bible or the World Whiskey Awards, it doesn't matter so much. And actually this year the Whiskey Bible Awards, the second, I think it was second or third place whiskey, I think it was second, was a whiskey by Paul John, also from India, a whiskey called their Mithuna. So that's the first time India has ever been in the top 3. So
baby steps.
Baby steps, it is. And I think we're moving there, but we're moving in that direction that actually they're getting that recognition.
It's actually for whiskey in general, the whole industry, it's such a long history, and it's a fairly, or at least in the past, it's a fairly slow evolving industry as an area. And so to make the inroads that Indian whiskey has over the past, let's say, couple of decades, like you said, in terms of single malt, they've really stepped up their game, right? To really get that progress and to see that then coming into fruition is actually really pretty impressive, especially when you're doing so under the almost shadow of this assumption that, okay, Scotland, Ireland, America, those places make whiskey. And then, of course, you've got this craze over Japanese whiskey now. And so underneath all of that, Indian whiskey has to then start, like, break through almost, right?
Yeah. Well, good news is I think Murray has declared
We've got
himself a
one
convert. So that is a win. Happy days.
It's an amazing whiskey, and I've talked about history, but to touch on the whiskey, it's most Indian whiskey, certainly Rampur and Paul John, they're using local Indian barley. So it's a slightly different style of barley than you're used to in Scotch. So Scotch is something called Turo barley. And if you imagine a stalk, the barley sits like that on the stalks, and you've got 2 little rows of barley all the way up. Six row barley is exactly that. It's 6 rows of barley, but you've got big bits and small bits, and it's a real pain to work with because you've got different size husks and you've got different bits to manage, and it's frustrating and it's difficult. It's slower. It's more time consuming, but as a result, you get an oilier, richer spirit of the base. So most Indian whiskey, you've got this oilier, richer texture already to start with, and then the variety. Someone said to me recently, it's like, oh, what style would you describe as Indian whiskey? And it's like, there is no style. There's 4 distilleries that are as far apart as Perth to Sydney in distance. It's like there isn't really a style. There's one guy doing it in Goa. There's one guy doing it in Uttar Pradesh. There's one guy doing it right in the south. It's a vast country with vast different climatic conditions. And in Rampur, where this is made, it's there's a huge amount of evaporation, much similar to the States. Most of the whiskies were aging about 3 to 4 years of age, and it's really that because we're losing 4 times more than Scotland. So average loss is about 5 to 8% of spirit loss per annum.
Andy, you'll never know what is quiz question number 2.
Didn't say that. It's fine.
I was going to ask, whilst we're just looking at the Google Earth image of where Rampur is situated, is that just that's where they set up? Because I was interested, from what you just said about evaporation, is it being so close to the Himalayas, has that factored in with the climate, or is that just a pure coincidence?
No, I think at the moment it's for most distillers in India, it's purely based on convenience to location, and they whilst they've been making whiskey for 25 years, they've been making spirits since the 1940s. They are one of the biggest producers of gin, vodka, blended whiskey, rum, you name it, in Australia. That's in India. So they are huge as a producer, and whiskey is a very tiny proportion of what they make. So they hadn't.
Water as well would be important, right?
Water is definitely certainly key in that production side. So we're definitely looking at what your water source is locally, but I don't think they've really gone down to the point of climate from a production point of view and looking at that from a site perspective. I think it's for all of the companies based. I think Amrit, Paul John, Rampur, they're all purely based on location and what's convenient rather than anything else.
Good. Luke, Murray, did you have any questions there? Anything that you'd like to add or ask?
Yeah, well, I was, one of the things that struck me, obviously, as Murray mentioned as well, the kind of like tropical flavors, pineapple, that sort of exotic fruit flavor coming through is probably a lot stronger than you necessarily expect. Of course, you think, okay, it's a warmer climate. We're expecting from Indian whiskey anyway to have perhaps more of the tropical flavors, but it actually came across much more intense than I was expecting, certainly. And it's interesting that you mentioned about the actual reasons why it's got that oiliness, because that oiliness is really, really noticeable and it's brilliant. And it's not often, I suppose outside of whiskey, you don't really talk about oiliness as a positive thing.
Yeah.
But it really is. And this is one of those kind of prime examples of why it's a nice thing to have in the whiskey, that it really helps things to one, linger a little bit more, so you get to savor it a little bit more, but it just, I don't know, it kind of smoothens out the entire experience for me. So it's great.
No, it's definitely a key flavor profile in most whiskeys that are using 6-row barley. It's that oily texture and that viscosity, and the tropical fruit note is it's a mixture of things. It's their spirit run is they're making a quite fruity, heavy fruity based spirit at the initial stages, but then at the same time it's that factor of we've gone from ex-bourbon casks, which give you that bit more kind of vanilla to soft fruits, and then switching it into PX casks, which are far bigger in size anyway. So we're talking 3 times the size of a cask than a bourbon cask. And you've got this massive cask that is then sort of bringing in that kind of tropical fruit and that sort of fruitcake kind of characters. And I think in Scotch whiskey that's long maturation in PX, you quite often get heavy, dense sort of fruitcake kind of Christmas kind of flavors. And in Indian climate, it seems to be that little bit more tropical side, and that's aided even more so by that bourbon maturation first.
Fantastic. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for that, Andy. Really appreciate your insights. And I think, well, certainly both whiskies we've tried so far have been exceptionally good. So thank you to both of you for presenting those.
Out of interest, has anyone tried Indian whiskey before this session?
I have not, but I'm certainly not very well versed in whiskey. I'm not sure if you have, Luke.
Yeah, for me, Amaret has been something I've had quite a bit of.
Yeah.
That's been kind of my main one. I've been aware of Paul John's whiskies around for a little while. I've not tried them yet, but yeah, Amaret's the main one that I've had a bottle or two of. Yeah, not in one go, of course.
All right, so we're going to move on to whiskey number 3, which is the Japanese, the Kyo. And I'm going to hand over to Luke to present this one to us.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, cool. So it's actually kind of it's great that we get to talk about 3 different countries, not just 3 different styles of wine, and they are quite distinct. But it's one of the points that Andy made a minute ago, talking about the Indian distilleries, is actually a really key point about Japanese whiskies. Obviously, Andy mentioned there, people ask, is there a specific style of Indian whiskey? Well, not really. There's not one specific set style. There's huge, massive amounts of space between each distillery. They have very different approaches. Now, for me, I feel Japanese whiskey especially has this stereotype of style to the whiskeys that most people will go into a Japanese whiskey expecting a specific style. It's going to be quite light, it's going to be quite floral, and for the most part that's actually quite accurate as a generalization. The reason behind that, again, just like India, it's only got a handful of distilleries, or it has done for for decades now. Only a handful of distilleries, a much smaller country than India, obviously, and there's a lot more similarities into the approach because most of the distilleries are owned by just a couple of companies, so they have this similar approach to the production. They're all fairly high altitude, the distilleries in Japan. That's quite a common factor, and that ends up having a bit of an effect on the end product of the whiskey. So there is a particular style that we can expect from Japanese whiskey in general, and it's interesting now with this Kyo to see that and to think about what we normally expect from Japanese whiskey, and to kind of see, one, the similarities to the typical style that we're used to, but also kind of the differences that we see. And we can talk about the reasons why there are some differences. But straight away, one of the big notes for me, on the nose, you can tell quite quickly there's this kind of unique element to it, which is kind of like sandalwood, similar to incense, almost unburnt incense in a sort of way for me. And that's because, as you can see on the screen there on the left, that tree is Mitsunara oak, an oak tree found in Japan that's gnarly as hell, of course, as we can see in that photo, but has this wonderful characteristic to it when it's used as an oak, an oak for barrels, as we can see on the right, which is those are packed up and tucked away nicely as well. But Mitsunara oak is this incredible, very expensive nightmare of a wood to work with. It's an absolute pain to produce a good barrel with it. It's not easy to get it produced and to actually make the barrel. There's not as many people making those barrels, and it costs a lot of money to do that. It's also difficult to make it. They're kind of much more porous, the water content in the wood, is much higher, so it ends up being much easier for leakage. And that's one of the kind of nightmare situations, right? When you're maturing your whiskies. Obviously, Andy mentioned about the climate in India being that much warmer. You lose, like in that question, you lose a lot more whiskey to evaporation. Well, of course, Japan doesn't necessarily have that climate, but it has this oak working against them, where it's adding leakage to the problem. So it's quite a costly thing to use, but it creates this, I think, fantastic kind of aroma. One of the biggest things for me is on the nose. The oak really, really comes through. That's where you get one of the biggest noticeable differences on the whiskey, is on the nose. And so that's one of the kind of founding reasons why Kyo, this whiskey, was actually created. It was done as a bit of a project to highlight the benefits of Mitsunara oak. That was kind of the purpose behind this production. And it's a really interesting production because Kyo are a little bit different to most whiskey companies. They don't have a distillery. So these guys didn't distill this whiskey, which is quite a unique approach. You do see it in Scotland, you see it in America, you see it all over the place, actually. You don't necessarily hear about it, this process of teaspooning, where a company will purchase X amount of whiskey from a distillery that's already up and running, already producing, and legally, whether or not they actually do it, legally, they write down that they add just a teaspoon, just a little bit of a different distillery's whiskey into there. And that means whoever sells the product then can't label it describing and explaining which distillery it's from, right? So it protects the company. It also means the seller then gets, generally speaking, the idea is teaspoon, it's a very small fraction. It won't change anything, even if they did do that, right? So Kyo has this approach of taking this teaspooned whiskey, but one of the key points is obviously to highlight this this Mitsunara oak barrel. What they've done, and this is one of the key differences for Kyo, there's this fantastic French company, Michel Couvret, who also does the same thing, where they purchase their teaspooned whiskey, but different to other companies where they purchase it already in barrel. They purchase it as a new make spirit before it's gone into barrel. So it's clear, you don't have any oak treatment whatsoever. And then Kyo then bring their own barrels into the equation. And that's where this famous Mitsunara oak is featured and highlighted. And then Kyo have their own location to mature the whiskey themselves.
So Luke, sorry to interrupt you. You mentioned they have their own location to mature the whiskey, but as the slide just showed there, am I right in saying it takes a bit of a trip to do that?
Yeah, it's a lucky whiskey. It has a cruise. It has a little cruise for a few months. So the
at
photo
the moment, probably a little bit longer, noticing that it's going
just
straight
stuck.
through the sewers.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, not an ideal spot to be going through right now. So they've got an extension to it. But yeah, as you saw, those barrels just then were all wrapped up and set aside to then go onto a container ship. And this is one of these, again, a second kind of unique approach to the whiskey making, where they kind of looked back in history to see what sort of unique approaches they can take to kind of improve. The biggest thing is to improve the difference of that oak. Mitsunara oak, again, is one of these things where the effects of it after a little while really die down, and it really has a much smaller impact on the whiskey. And so to try to reinvigorate that and try and really encourage it to interact with the whiskey as much as possible, they stick it onto a boat, they give it a nice tour around the world, and away it goes. And there's a few reasons why it's not as gimmicky as it might sound. Obviously, it sounds a little bit hit or miss. It sounds a little bit of an odd idea or approach. The idea is, one, obviously the movement. It means the whiskey inside is sloshing all over the place, smashing about. There's more interaction with the actual oak, with the charred oak inside the barrel. It does also you can see there as well, it's going across the equator multiple times. So there's a big change in climate, there's a big change in kind of air pressure and things like that, and that really does help to increase that kind of activity going on inside the barrel, where the oak is much more likely to interact and actually have an effect. And that comes across quite nicely because they have what is a non-age statement whiskey. So it's not going to be 20 something years old or anything like that. But it's getting a lot out of that oak, even with a shorter amount of time in barrel.
Luke, just a quick question. Actually, Nestor and Murray both sort of asked the same question. But regarding the sort of teaspooning method, I suppose the question is sort of, do people see this as a lesser quality? Is that just a misconception due to, sort of the lack of purity, that people see, when you talk about single malt, things like that. But yeah, just a couple of questions on that one.
Yeah, and it's a really good point, and it's probably one of the biggest concerns people will have when they hear about the idea of these teaspoon whiskies, right? One of the big things here is obviously there's this huge demand for whiskey globally, and there's also, as G was saying about that 18-year-old Sazerac, there's this not quite ready to meet those demands, right? Because it takes, in that case, 18 years to produce it. It takes a long time to mature. So, okay, you've got the demand now, but in 18 years' time, you'll finally be able to meet that. But obviously, the demand will be higher. And so you have these distilleries, and again, with Japan especially having a smaller number of distilleries, you have these distilleries which 10, 15 years ago did not realize that they needed to produce this much. And so while the Japanese whiskey market is really struggling to keep up with demands, their current production in the distillery is actually able to meet those demands. And it means that they have this opportunity where they can produce the exact same sort of spirit as they would normally be distilling. And if it means they can then sell it on to a company who's a newer company who are in the process of building their distillery, which Kaio is actually in the process of building their distillery. So once that's finished, they then have to distill their own whiskey. They then have to mature it for 5-6 years or so before they can release it. So there's a bit of time where they help each other out in a sense. But to protect the brand, you've got to teaspoon it, essentially.
Nice.
Technically.
Cool. I'm curious, Luke, actually, I had a question. I picked up a bottle of this for a friend's 30th a couple of weeks back, purely because it kind of, there was a side story with him, but I love the story of Kaio with the oak and also the voyage it takes. And it's a nice one to kind of recount and tell. As a kind of benchmark into Japanese whiskey, because I know that he's kind of getting into it, but not necessarily a connoisseur. Is this something that is, I know you mentioned at the start, fairly consistent with the style? Is it a good one to kind of get into? Is there a little bit more of a kind of niche style in the overall context?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the Kaio compared to the rest of, still generalizations, but the rest of Japanese whiskies, it is quite different. And one of the big reason is that the Mitsunara oak, it has that kind of sandalwood. It has a lot of vanilla coming through as well. So it is a little bit different to typical Japanese whiskies. That being said, I do think it's much more of a, I suppose, relatable kind of palate and experience in terms of a whiskey. If you're coming from outside of Japanese whiskies, then this is perhaps more of a relatable way to go, whereas especially so in terms of getting ones that are now very difficult or very, very expensive to get hold of, you're getting incredible quality without necessarily having to put $500-$600 down on a bottle, which could very well also be non-age statement at a similar age, right? And obviously you're getting a slightly different profile, but it gives you some of those qualities as well. it's quite often like Japanese whiskey is quite often compared to perhaps Scotch from like the lowlands, right, of Scotland, and it's got that sort of, even with this, even after that Mitsunara oak, it's still got some of those kind of floral lighter notes coming through as well.
Great. Awesome. So that brings us to just up to past. Guys, did you have anything that you'd like to kind of add into that?
Only I'm a bit disappointed that we didn't get sent any Kayo. Thanks very much. Maybe we can correct that for the next time. But, no, apart from that, it's been a really enjoyable hour, and I want to say thanks for inviting us. I know that there's a world of whiskey out there, and of course we can probably do this every day for the next certainly longer than I'm going to be on the planet, but it's a great thing to do, and yeah, good job, guys. Thanks very much. Yeah, Andy.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, no, I think it's Japanese whiskies, we touched on it earlier, is changing and developing so much, and I think I read a great book by Dave Broom about Japanese whiskey, and he talks about sort of the history and the culture and just the sort of the mindset of the Japanese in what they do in their everyday life. And I think the term was kaseki, which is continuous improvement and continuous development. And it's with everything that you do, how can you tweak, how can you adapt, how can you change, and how you can improve. And it's so noticeable in their whiskies. And the Scots have been doing it for years. And you go and ask the guys at Springbank, why do you distill your whiskey 2.5 times? And they say, because you always have. And we changed it once and it didn't go too well. So, we just continue to do this. And they've no factual logic or understanding as to why they do it, but they just do it because they do it. And the Japanese approach to making whiskey is bound to change the industry for the better. And it's bringing that scientific element, and it's bringing that sort of real, rather than just shove it and see. It's this scientific aspect that you're now seeing in master distillers in Scotland as an impact. The people that are coming forward for those roles are now very much scientific background versus they've worked their way through the distillery and there they go. Glenfiddich and Glenmorangie, 2 prime examples, the 2 scientists that are now heading up the distillation. And I think that's making wonders for the industry, and it's what Japanese whiskey is famous for, is they've continuously tweaked and improved and done an amazing job at it.
Amazing. Yeah, that kind of samurai sword sort of mentality to their industry is amazing. Brill. Okay, so it's what everybody's been waiting for. We had a couple of dropouts this evening, and a few guests that didn't text in. So, Murray, I'm really fingers crossed for you here, mate. So hopefully you get this one. I'm just going to share my screen. So good luck.
Oh, did it stop first? Yay!
Brilliant.
Murray read 4 names in there.
Yeah, so you get 3 for a correct answer and 1 for an incorrect. So
awesome. Murray nailed it, man.
He had 1 right and 1 wrong. Yeah, 1 wrong there. So
I've never won anything before in my life.
Glad to change that, along with now enjoying Indian whiskey. Congratulations, Murray. I'll get Scott to sort that out for you. There was a good comment from Nestor in here when we're talking about value Japanese whiskey. Has anyone else tried the Akashi, the Battle of Divinity single malt whiskies before? Said he had an extreme reaction when he saw the price of that. So I actually don't know what the price is. That would be a question for you, Luke.
Some of the prices can be pretty astronomical, that's for sure. They can really get up there. And again, I mean, it's one of those things about supply and demand, right? I mean, you guys will definitely know that about like the 18-year-old with the Sazerac. It's it's excruciatingly difficult to get a hold of. And obviously, once you do get a hold of it, it's not necessarily the same price point as the 6-year-old, which makes a lot of sense when there's so much demand.
Yeah, exactly. And just in that limited supply as well. I mean, I literally think we had maybe a few dozen bottles this year in the Sazerac 18. So that few dozen bottles for the year has to go around.
It's tricky, yeah.
Not only the retail aspect, but also the on-premise, the bars and stuff. So it's one of those kind of situations. It's a nice place to be right now, but yeah, I don't know. With Andy's comment about forecasting, Buffalo Trace at the moment are going under the biggest expansion that I've ever seen in a whiskey distillery, and then spending close to $1.5 billion on new warehouses, new tanks, new fermentation, new coolers, new bottling halls, new this, that, and the other. They're gearing up to really produce some incredible amounts of whiskey. But the great thing is about that distillery, there's even right now, the success that they have, they still produce everything. Around about 75-80% that they make is all still done by hand, which is an incredible story and legacy, right? And hopefully the story will continue that in 20 and 30 years time we're still drinking great whiskey, and we don't go backwards 20, 30 years to drinking not so much great whiskey.
And talking of drinking whiskey, for anybody who's tuning in retrospectively, some of the guests that couldn't make it this evening, if you have been particularly impressed by any of these, we obviously do have access to them. So feel free to scan the QR code or drop us a text to the number on the screen there with your name. Well, not in this case, not the wine, the whiskey, and the quantity that you'd like. If you can just move us on one there, Jane. A couple of plugs for upcoming tastings. Back to the usual wines. So we've got Malbec on the 15th, a Tasmanian deep dive with Andrea. She's a master of wine on the 22nd. And then we're over to France on the 13th of May for the Loire Valley. Those are all going to be happening online. And then if you're interested in exploring further face-to-face tastings with wine, we've got What is Tannin on the 4th of May, Desserts and Fortifieds on the 1st, and then one that I'm super excited to be attending is Australian Classics with Ned Goodwin.
And just real quick, that date's incorrect. So that one that's come up to the 19th of May. So the Australian Classics will be, soon, next month. Can't believe it.
Excellent. Okay, so again, thanks so much to our guest speakers this evening. It's such a pleasure to get your insights, and it really is massively appreciated. So thanks from all of us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for having us.